It's a common misconception that only risk-takers engage in cave diving. At first glance, it appears to be a dangerous pastime. Therefore, it stands to reason that those who engage in it must have a propensity for taking risks. But if there's one thing you have to learn about cave diving, it's that most cave divers don't want to take risks. Planning out these dives involves a lot of math, chemistry, and physics, which is something that is really underestimated and that most people usually ignore. Even though these ideas are hard to grasp, they frequently mean the difference between life and death while cave diving. And that was the case with Wodek Szymanowski. So what happened to Wodek Szymanowski? And was it something that he would have foreseen? Well, let's find out. Wodek Szymanowski, a Polish native born in 1958, first learned about cave diving at the conclusion of high school. Then, when he arrived at the university and saw that they had classes that really allowed him to go cave exploring, he immediately signed up. Wodek was not only a really upbeat and positive person, but he was also one of those individuals who was just brilliant at anything they attempted. Because of how rapidly he studied everything, he became an expert in it. He was among the very first stockbrokers in all of Poland, and he was quite successful in this line of work. Along with his passion for cave exploration, he was an accomplished climber who had already conquered the Tatra mountain range in Poland, the Dolomites in Italy, and the Swiss and French Alps. But then, cave diving began to gain popularity, and he saw many of his colleagues switch from dry caving to underwater caving. As the business changed in that direction, Wodek decided it was time for him to follow suit because he had always wanted to start diving. Wodek naturally began with some introductory classes, but due to his caving expertise and natural abilities, he swiftly rose to become one of Poland's top divers. Then, in April 2005, he went on another one of his frequent trips to France. This time, he went to Bourg Saint-Andéol to look into some of its unique flooding systems. And these are indeed some uncommon systems. Goule de la Tannerie, which is the biggest, is more than a kilometer long and at least 210 meters, over 700 feet deep. Goule de Pont is nearly as deep, but a little shorter in length. Along with being enormous, these caverns are also full of gorgeously colored limestone passages and crystal clear water. Wodek decided to visit both of these caverns over the course of 2 days rather than just one, because if a little is good, more is better. Later, on an April morning, Wodek got ready to go into one of these unassuming ponds by putting on all of his gear in the cobblestone parking lot of the park. This was intended to be the Goule de la Tannerie, which is unusually formed in that it spans horizontally for more than 2,000 feet, or 610 meters, and only reaches a depth of less than 30 feet, or 9.14 meters, before deepening. But after that first horizontal tube, it immediately descends to that enormous 700-foot depth. A 300-foot, or 91.44 meter shaft in one portion plunges almost vertically into the ground. But because of how much gas you have to bring with you and the length of that first horizontal portion, it's sort of impractical to go very deep. He would reserve his planned deep dive for the following day in the other cave. Wodek and his crew went back to their lodgings after finishing that day's work and testing all of their equipment so that they could get a decent night's sleep in preparation for the next day's record-breaking dive. And because Wodek wanted to break his own depth record and raise it to over 400 feet, this dive was going to be exceptional. Goule de Pont was ideal for this, since it swiftly fell without adding much horizontal space. This allowed him to break his own record for depth in this beautiful cave while spending less time underwater. The next morning at 9 a.m., he and his team returned to the pond to prepare all of their equipment. He would be utilizing his preferred rebreather for this dive, along with 2 backup gas cylinders, one with air for the shallower areas and one with trimix for the deeper sections. Even though a rebreather is more complicated than a regular system, it has some advantages, like letting you stay underwater for a long time. Rebreathers, on the other hand, are pricier and more intricate, but that's also exactly what Wodek enjoyed. Even when simpler equipment was available, he frequently chose more sophisticated items because he enjoyed fiddling with them. He completed his lengthy pre-rebreather checklist to make sure everything was in working order before diving in. He posed for a few photos on the surface before dipping his head beneath the water. In comparison to his conception of caverns, Wodek was bulkier due to the rebreather and more cylinders, but in Guled de Pont, there was just one narrow passage near the cave's entrance. For rebreathers, you must keep an eye on the oxygen content of your breathing gas as you progress through the water-filled corridors and adjust it to the depth you are at in order to equalize the pressure. Additionally, you need to keep track of the data on your dive computer and check the pressure in your cylinders. Additionally, you need to pay attention to how rapidly you're dropping and how long you've been submerged. It's not as simple as simply adding air to your buoyancy device. At different depths, different amounts of air are needed to give the same amount of buoyancy. That is because air gets smaller and less buoyant as you go deeper. The inverse is then accurate as we move upward. And you have to accomplish it all in a maze of completely dark tunnels, being careful not to bump into anything or kick up any mud lest you effectively go blind. As you might imagine, even with a clear brain, keeping track of all this demands a lot of attention. If you make a mistake and don't have a clear head, things might quickly become extremely ugly. Wodek descended diagonally from the surface to the first and only limitation at around 35 feet at 10 o'clock. Not wanting to disrupt the silt, he cautiously eased his tanks and equipment through. The cave continues another 165 feet virtually horizontally after the initial dip. There is a sudden drop down a 30-foot vertical shaft at the end of this tunnel. When he got to the hole, Wodek put his body in a way that let him drop while staying flat. With the tools he was employing, this was essential. But then, Wodek's problems started. Divers breathe a mixture of different gases in addition to standard air to counteract the narcotic effects of various gases. This narcotic effect is like being very sleepy or drunk, but it doesn't affect your reflexes or judgment. This is somewhat mitigated by the mixture of gases that deep divers employ, but it can still have an impact. Narcosis affects people differently, even changing from day to day within the same person. Some people have an odd tolerance to it, while others are extremely susceptible to it. Wodek most certainly saw that this narcotic effect was especially acute that day when he descended to below 200 feet. But being incredibly skilled and only 140 vertical feet from his depth record, he probably figured it was simply one of those days and kept going. It's also likely that he was already substantially disabled at this stage of his dive. The steep steps come to an end at 260 feet below the surface, when there is another brief level corridor. Wodek's ability to think clearly was deteriorating, but he was so close to finishing that he couldn't stop. Just one more drop would be enough before he rose again. Unfortunately, this would be his last and most devastating mistake. Wodek actually had no business being in the water that day. He had made a blunder that had already ruined this endeavor before he had even entered the water. Divers employ a combination of oxygen, helium, and nitrogen called trimix, which comes in various ratios for different depths. This has to be somewhat accurate and exact. Oxygen poisoning occurs when there is too much oxygen present. Hypoxia results from getting too little oxygen, and so forth. Wodek had never tested the combination he was using and had either combined the incorrect gases or grabbed the incorrect tank. He was inhaling far too much of the incorrect gas combination, which is why it was extremely intense. He began to descend after swimming over the ledge of the last 100-foot vertical shaft. Wodek kept a close eye on his oxygen, pressure, and everything else, but he still made mistakes. His thoughts were clouded, and he couldn't quite make out what was going on as he fell. He wasn't adequately equalizing the pressure, which is why his breathing became difficult halfway down the vertical shaft. He kept going down quickly until he eventually hit the ground. He attempted to switch the circuit to the spare cylinder on his rebreather since he was now 360 feet under the surface and barely able to breathe. But when he finally understood and began breathing once more, he was either too impaired or semi-conscious. He then started breathing in water after the mouthpiece fell out of his mouth. The surface team became aware that something was off at about 3 p.m., so they made 2 efforts to save Wodek at a depth of 230 feet, but he was still out of their grasp at that point. These failed attempts led them to the realization that Wodek had perished somewhere in the depths of Guled de Pont. Then, the next day, his body was found at the bottom of a vertical shaft, 360 feet below the surface, with his mouthpiece out and 2 full backup cylinders. So, was Wodek right to use rebreathers instead of normal, simpler equipment? And do you think that mistake cost him his life?